Hello, everybody. My name is Brandon Green, and I'm the CEO of Alchemy of Money. And I have with me today the infamous Nicole Welsh, who is, I don't know, you're a little bit of everything around here, Nicole, honestly, and including the research and analytics department. Excuse me. I'm so impressed. So I'm excited to dive in today. So Alchemy every quarter pulls together the statistics showing what's happening in agents' businesses, and we love to just have a little conversation about that and show that data to everybody out there in the field so you can compare how your business relates to some of the other businesses that are out there. And then we'll also discuss some best practices for a few minutes and give you some perspective. So let's dive in, Nicole. So you analyzed 98,614 transactions to get this data pulled together. And I'm curious if we start with just the revenue side, what are
Mhm.
some of your insights as you look at 2025's revenue in the agent business?
Yeah, so I think overall, we looked at the percentage of listing revenue versus sales revenue. We thought that would be a really interesting number. At the beginning of this year, there was a lot of stuff happening with different lawsuits and things like that that we thought
Mm.
would really impact this listing versus sales split. So we thought we were going to see some divergence, but what we've kind of noticed is that they kind of flip-flop around. One quarter is a little more listing, one quarter is a little more sales, but they remain fairly evenly split across
Yeah,
the board.
yeah.
But we do notice that kind of like at a little bit of a low point in terms of percentage of both of those. So like agent businesses maybe had a little bit more stuff going on to supplement their overall revenue in Q4 of 2025. So I was wondering, Brandon, what your take was on that, why that might be.
Yeah, in Q4, you can see that listing revenue was below buyer revenue, which, interestingly, if you look at the number of listings that were available in the marketplace at the end of Q4, it was pretty low. So it does appear that the overall market swing of availability has impacted our members' numbers as well. But the good news is people have been like emphasizing the buyer side and saying, "Hey, now's a really good time." And we saw their buyer revenue actually be a little bit more. But I generally agree with you. Like, quarter by quarter, it goes up a little bit down, a little, but more or less is remaining relatively even. And, if you're looking at these numbers and you're like, they don't add up to 100, well, the difference is usually other revenue that might be coming in or referral fees. Now, that also can make up a percentage of the revenue. Now, on cost of sale, Nicole, I think it's interesting that agent businesses had 30% in Q1, 29% in Q2, 22% in Q3, then 28% in Q4. And we know that the general best practice recommendation is not to be above 30%. And if you're listening and you're wondering what cost of sale is, that would be any referral fees paid out or splits to buyer or listing agents on your team or referral fees paid out. That number, I was actually surprised on how spot on the model
Me too.
that was.
Yeah, I was proud of our group here for
Yeah,
kind of keeping it right at that number that was recommended for their
yeah,
business size. So it sounds to me like overall the group is doing a pretty good job of figuring out their splits, like having a great
yes.
team set up. They really have that pinned down.
Yeah, this is a big indicator of the health of the team we see, right? If the cost of sale trends too high, then profitability generally trends too low. If the cost of sale is too low, then agents on the team aren't making enough money. So, getting this calibration to about 30 is pretty important. Now, that varies a little bit depending on the size of your team. So, if you're listening right now and you've got, 10 agents, 15 agents on your team, or you have one agent on your team, that's going to be a little different. But the fact that it's sort of normalizing out around 30%, I was like, huh, pretty interesting. Let's go to compensation. So,
Yeah.
you know, this one, we've been talking about this now for a while. Like,
Yeah.
remember 2024? It was like in 2023, people were like, woohoo, just gonna pay them anybody anything they want. And we were like,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, compensation is really eating up a huge percentage of the revenue. What are you seeing in 2025?
More of the same, honestly.
More the same.
Um, I think that we were hopeful that, I think there were a lot of changes that have occurred in the market and that have occurred in businesses over the last several years. And um, we kind of saw a little bit last year, toward the end of last year, businesses starting to lean out their employment a little bit and trying to right size their compensation a bit.
Yeah.
And we even saw that, a little bit this year. But as we approached Q4, compensation really started back to eating up a very, very large percentage of that revenue. Now, I think that is likely because revenue was lower in Q4 and not because everybody hired more people.
Yeah.
But I think that it's important for our business owners to look across the year and really think about, even at those, like, do I have the right amount of people working for me and that I'm compensating throughout the year? What do you think?
Well, I agree. And what we can see in the numbers is Q1 compensation as a percentage of revenue, 24%, Q2, 16%, Q3, 18%, Q4, 23, almost 24%. It's very clear that people have staffed up their organizations to handle the spring and fall market.
Mhm.
But then there's, the other whole half of the year. So the question often becomes, all right, if your staffing and fixed expenses as a result of salaries is not very flexible throughout the year, then are you essentially working hard during the good market to essentially pay for the loss in the backside of the slower part of the year? I think that's still a lot of that's happening. The challenge is there's not a lot of good fixes for it other than to be leaner with your staff at a time when you would rather have more or have compensation structures that allow a bit more movement with revenue. But that could be hard because a lot of W-2 staff people aren't really excited about variable compensation. So this is a big challenge. It remains a big challenge. We know that the model says anytime you start to float much above 15%, maybe 20% at the high, then you're going to have a problem materializing the profit you want at the end of the day. And that still is a thing.
And what we see, anecdotally, like, and the numbers reflect this, is exactly what you said, Brandon. Everybody's fine in Q2 and Q3.
Yeah.
But in the early part of the year and the late part of the year, payroll becomes a real struggle for our teams as well. And so it is
Yes.
something, that we encourage our members to think about what is sustainable over the course of the entire year, that you're not having to stress about payroll at any time. But like you said, it's probably one of the primary challenges that our members face. And we don't
Yes.
have the best solution for it.
Yeah. No, it's, the truth is you have to operate in a far more lean capacity during the heat of the market than most people would rather do. So that then in the rest of the season, you've got the ability to navigate that better. So continued challenge on that. Lead generation. So we know lead generation, ideally, you're not really exceeding 10% of revenue in most cases. Looks like 12.26 in Q1, 8.47 in Q2, 10.02 in Q3, 9.5 in Q4. You know, pretty good, I think, in terms of the model. What are your insights on the lead gen side?
Well, I was struck by the fact that every single quarter, the prospecting and marketing category specifically was a bit lower than what the model would recommend.
Oh yeah, I see
I,
that. Yeah.
so listing management, our members are helping their sellers out with those listings and making sure that those listings are ready to go. We can see that, but do you think, Brandon, that our members are putting enough into prospecting and marketing to get the outcomes that they want?
I mean, that's a good point. I mean, in Q2, it looks like a dip to 4.87%. And the truth is, if all you're doing is spending about 4 to 5% of your gross commission income on prospecting and marketing to grow your business, that's going to be hard. That's not much oxygen on that fire. And the highest it was, that's good insight, was 6.85%. So yeah, we're seeing some pretty big servicing on the listing side, but how much of that money is how much are people really allocating to grow the business to get more listings? It seems that that might, getting that balance can be pretty tough.
Yeah. Do you see, I'm looking at that 4.87 number in Q2, which is always a pretty good quarter for our
Yeah.
members. Q2 is
Yeah.
always pretty good. Do you think it's something like once the market gets a little bit hotter, people start thinking, I don't have to put as much into prospecting and marketing, and then that's maybe something that leads to a little bit more of a struggle later in the year?
Well, it's probably not coincidental that the spend on marketing dipped 2 months or 4 months before revenue in the business dipped.
Hmm.
So, yeah, I guess if you're waving a magic wand here, we would say, wow, Q2 and Q3 should be elevated marketing spend so that you have more leads coming in Q4 and Q1. But that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing the converse of that. So, yeah, I do think people just get busy or they get complacent and they're like, well, stuff's working here. Like, what can we? But the numbers would indicate we almost have the reverse problem, right? Of we're not investing at the top of the market in order to be more resilient on the bottom part of the market in the seasonal cycle. Yeah, that's true. Good insight, Nicole. That's why we got you here. I like that. Yeah, the numbers point that out pretty clear. All right, let's roll to net profit margin. So, this was a bit of a roller coaster ride, 18%, 32%, 26%, 15%. A lot of variability quarter by quarter. Any insight on the profit side?
You mentioned the seasonality of the market, and that's kind of what I see here. I see that, in those winter months, the beginning of the year and toward the holiday season, things start to slow down, and we see that in our profit margin too, right? It seems to me that expenses stay fairly fixed across our agent businesses, and what happens is that profit margin is either good or not so good. There's not a lot of changes being made based on the revenue that's being brought in. And that's tough because you're building the plane as you fly it with that. Do you have any recommendations, Brandon, for how people can be more variable with their
Yeah.
expenses through those challenging times?
I mean, the total, when I average it across the 4 quarters, it's 22.99%. So we're about 7.7% too low
Hmm.
generally. And that is entirely made up by the first quarter being so low. So it's almost like what we're going back to, which is somehow the organization, your team, you have to think about the future a little bit more. And when you're in the heat of the spring and the summer and maybe the fall market, and you're busier than you could ever be, unfortunately, is exactly the time that you need to be putting in more effort to create a little less seasonality in your business come December, January, and February. Because if the dip is too low in Q4 and Q1, you essentially spend all your time and money in Q2 and Q3 making up for that big dip. So the solution is make the dip a little bit less.
Mhm.
And that means putting in more effort, more marketing dollars, more prospecting at the same time you're doing more servicing. So tough to do, but or you just you build a lot of cash reserves.
Yeah, so your recommendation is, you know, yeah, we're pretty close to the model's recommendations for the spend, but your recommendation would be to really focus on trying to increase revenue across the year by investing in those quarters
Yeah.
where you have a little bit more to invest. And instead of trying to like reduce a little expense here and there, is that kind of how you see this?
Yeah. I mean, there's a 17-point drop between the high of Q2 and the low of Q4 in terms of the profit margin, 32% to 15%. That's that's going to make you somewhat nauseous. So another way to think about it is, we're recording this right now as the spring market starts. Now is the time to be thinking about and strategizing in your organization. What do you need to do for Q4 of this year and Q1 of 2027? So I know you're like, okay, spring market, here we go. Actually, what I want you to think about is, what are you going to do next winter? How do you right now make hiring decisions, marketing decisions, other kinds of decisions with the eye towards winter is coming again, so that it will flatten things out a little bit for you.
Yeah.
All right, let's go, Nicole. We have another group. So this is sort of across the group with a total GCI of 230,000. But we also did a group that has a higher GCI. This one looks like the average GCI was 875. So some bigger organizations, let's just take a look at them real quick. Revenue, you know, a little less variability, it looks like, between listings and sales. Like in Q4, for example, 39%, 39.3 were listings, 37.8 were sales, just a couple points spread there.
Pretty even split. Yep.
Pretty even split. Any thoughts or comments on revenue for this group approaching a million on average in GCI?
No, I think this really lines up with what we expect to see out of this group. Things are just a little bit more stable, I think, overall with these groups
Yeah.
with the higher GCI. And so we tend to see more even splits of numbers, less variability as we look at them.
Yeah. We also, though, see their cost of sale higher, right? Their cost of
Always.
sale, 35, 38, 40, 43. As you're approaching a million and going above a million in GCI, you probably have more agents on board. So we can certainly see that's having an impact in cost of sale, but their compensation as a percentage was a little bit lower. I don't know. What is your insight on the relationship between cost of sale and compensation in this group with higher GCI?
Yeah, I think that when this group, I mean, they just leverage a lot more.
Yeah.
So they have more agents on their team, and they usually have a lot more people that they're paying either W-2 salaries or as contractors. So we do see these numbers a little bit higher, especially in cost of sale. I was interested to see that these numbers were trending a bit lower than the group as a whole in compensation. I think that's related to higher revenue over the quarter. I think that they are pretty well staffed, but the revenue is just higher, making that percentage a little bit lower than the full group. But Brandon, do you think that they have figured out ways to allocate the work a little bit better to get these numbers the way they
Um, I I
or
think what you're seeing is it's just actually easier to run the business when you get to a million in GCI. You're not, at a razor's edge constantly. So it becomes a bit more normalized. You have a little bit more flexibility. When you're in the twos in GCI, like it's mostly you, and you're entirely dependent on your personal energy, which is why seasonality is such a killer, because you get tired, right? As your business gets bigger and you have more leverage, then you've just got more people around you. And I think we see that in how some of these numbers normalize. I mean, look at lead generation. This is fascinating. Look how consistent lead generation became. We went from 13% and then it went 6.4, 6.3, 6.9. Like some real consistency started to develop in the back half of the year around that spend.
Yeah, and it's interesting that this group seemed to have front loaded a lot of spend in lead gen at the beginning of the year and maybe was able to back off a little bit as the year progressed. Because look at that, 13% in Q1,
Yeah.
and then it normalized after that. So I'm curious about how that played out for those people.
Well, it certainly helped their profit margin. I mean, their profit margin was also more stable.
Yeah.
22, 29, 27, and 16. So a smaller gap between the high and the low, and only one quarter. was
Right.
low compared to the other group. They had 2 quarters that were off.
Yeah.
So
We do need to point out that this group also experienced a big drop in profit margin in Q4. So I
yes,
think that's, something that no matter the business you have to plan for. But like you said, Brandon, when you just are generating more revenue, you have more breathing room to deal with those swings.
there's really three big inflection points. One is getting to 250 in GCI, and everything below that is like one big bucket of dynamics in the business. The next is getting just a little bit above a million in GCI. Like that's another band where you see some of these patterns even out. And then the next big inflection point is when you exceed 3 million in GCI, then you have a whole nother set of dynamics and it becomes a far more stable scenario. We have one of our members who's well beyond that in GCI. And it's really interesting when we do every month the comparison of budget versus actual, like we're talking within dollars. They could predict within just a few dollars what the team is going to do because of the maturity of that level of GCI. So certainly the more money you make, generally speaking, the more stable these dynamics can become. But of course, every increment has its own set of challenges. Um, So, this is sort of our final slide here. You can see that, there still are a percentage of folks that are not profitable at all,
Hmm.
right? So, but 59% were in Q1 and 85, 75, and 65. We've seen this as a bit of a challenge for the last several years in this particular market shift. So, who knows if 26 is going to be substantially better than 25 in the terms of the market, but it'll be interesting for us to see if we can get this overall number of profitable entities to get closer into the 90s.
Yeah.
Any insight on the top three here, profit or average profit?
Yeah, I just agree. We hate to see these numbers because, we see this 85% in Q2 as a high for the number of percent of entities that were profitable at all, that made a single dollar after expenses. And our thinking for our members is, gosh, that means 15% weren't profitable, and that gets even more challenging to look at when we see the struggle that people are going through in Q1 and Q4. So focusing on profitability and those ways that we talked about before is what I think we would always recommend for our members.
And then finally, on this owner distribution, we do bookkeeping and taxes for agents, so we get to see kind of how they're managing their compensation. This is not the amount of money people are paying themselves on a W-2. This is how much they're just distributing to themselves. So, um, Q4 has a higher distribution number, and we just discussed Q4 often has a lower revenue number.
Yeah.
So, something to look at in your own business is what's the relationship between your revenue and your distributions. If you're finding you need to distribute during periods of time where you have the lowest revenue, that could be something to work on this year as you work to sort of even out the business from seasonality and make sure you have enough to be really profitable in the slower months of the year.
Yeah, and one thing that I think we would rather see is a little bit more consistency in that compensation category, which we should mention does include owner's comp to themselves. So there's some owner's compensation included in that category, but the more that our business owners can get their what they need to pay themselves regularized in a way that allows them to have a predictable experience. I think it's just overall better than having variable compensation to themselves through distributions at random times in the year. That helps them kind of build that predictable business like you were talking about.
So it seems that sort of some takeaways, good progress in 2025, the ones I see, continue to work on this dynamic of seasonality just to elevate the lower season a little bit would make a huge difference in the overall profitability of the company over the course of the year. We tell our members all the time that your December, January, February is everything in the context of how your year is going to go from a profit standpoint. So you're not literally climbing yourself out of a deep hole haul the rest of the year. So the good news is now actually is the time to be focused on that for the winter season that will still come. So that's kind of my takeaway. What's your final thought here on this?
Yeah, I mean, I just have to agree with you that, it's great that the weather is starting to get warmer here in Pennsylvania. I think in DC it's probably getting a little warmer too. I think we all see spring on the horizon here, and then, just thinking about how to leverage these months to build a more consistent and stable business throughout the rest of the year, is I think the main takeaway today.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in to our quick review of the numbers. Again, Brandon Green, Alchemy of Money, Nicole Welsh, and we help with bookkeeping and taxes for agents across the country. And we, of course, would love to help you too. Our website address is alchemyofmoney.co. That will be linked in the comments below. We'll see you later.